Welcome back to Light the Fuse. And Charles, how you doing? How you feeling?
I feel great, Drew. How do you feel? How are you doing?
I feel good. You know, we've done a lot of recording over the past few days, and you know, I'm really excited to get some of these episodes out. So, you know, I'm ready to go. I'm feeling good.
Yeah, they're sort of they're not people who worked on the movies, but they're people who have really interesting, great perspectives on the movies.
And sometimes that's enough, because we certainly don't offer any kind of perspective. So if we can bring somebody in to facilitate that, then we're happy. So
yes. Yeah. Oh, well, and also I wanted to say, though, before we get into this episode, this weekend, the weekend this episode comes out is the weekend of the Oscars. And we will cover all the results in a Patreon episode. So fingers crossed, we are very happy about Top Gun Maverick winning a lot. But subscribe to the Patreon to get the bonus episode that will go into detail on all the results of the Oscars, where we will hopefully be celebrating and not sad at all.
Yeah, if you want to listen to us weeping uncontrollably for happy or sad reasons, go ahead and think about joining that Patreon.
No matter what, you're going to get us weeping. So you want to sign up for the Patreon at patreon.com/lightthefuse. Speaking of the Oscars, though, also Todd Field has been out in the world promoting Tar, which is up for a bunch of Oscars, which is a fantastic movie. And Todd Field told some stories about Tom Cruise that were really amazing. You saw that, right? Have we talked about it?
I don't think we've talked about it yet, no.
Todd Field is a writer-director, and he's directed 3 movies now. Little Children, the most recent Tar, and his first movie, In the Bedroom. But he acted in Eyes Wide Shut, the Stanley Kubrick movie, with Tom Cruise, and so spent a lot of time making that movie with Tom Cruise. And so he had some stories he was telling about he had not made a movie yet, but he wanted to adapt a short story into a movie, and that was In the Bedroom. And I think on set, Tom Cruise, it was something like Tom Cruise told him, like, oh, you got to do it. You can't, no excuses. You need to make it happen. He was like very encouraging and made him like go through the process of like, don't make any excuses. Just go do it. Go get the rights that this is the movie you want to make. You got to go make it. Like it was.
Wasn't he worried about tone or something too? And Cruise was kind of reassuring him that it would be okay. Was that part of that?
Oh, I don't know. I'm sure he's told the story a few times on the circuit, so I might have missed that aspect of it. But then there was also the post-production story, which I'm sure you heard, right? About Harvey Weinstein.
Oh, yes.
Because Harvey Weinstein acquired In the Bedroom, and Todd Field was so upset, and he told Tom Cruise about it and was like, what am I going to do? Like, Harvey Weinstein wants to cut up my movie and he wants to like change it. You know, it did so. I think it played at Sundance it played it somewhere at some festival, and it was a huge deal and everybody loved it. Harvey Weinstein acquires it, and then of course he had that nickname Harvey Scissorhands. He's just the worst, and he wanted to cut it up. And so Tom Cruise said to Todd Field, "Okay, this is what you're gonna do," and he like laid out for Todd Field everything he had to do step by step. He's like, you're gonna go along with everything he says. You're gonna tell him, oh yeah, great, okay, yeah. He's gonna act like all of his ideas are wonderful and make all the cuts. And then you're gonna test screen it, and the test screenings are gonna be lower scores than your version of the movie. And then he's gonna want to cut it more, and you just got to keep acting like, oh yeah, these are all great ideas, Harvey, yeah, and just keep cutting it and butcher the movie. It's gonna be painful, but you got to go through this whole process. The scores are gonna keep getting lower and lower, and Harvey Weinstein's gonna be baffled and be like, I don't know what's going on. And then at that point, after like months of this process, before the movie comes out, you say to him, hey, you know what? Maybe we should just test the original version of the movie. Like, let's just see what happens. And then that'll test. Scores will be way higher, and then he'll release that version of the movie. And that's exactly what happened, which is so amazing.
That's so funny. And of course, that was nominated for every Oscar the year it came out, and is a beloved movie to this day.
Yeah,
amazing.
It was just incredible to hear that story. And I guess speaking of Oscars, we've got an Oscar winner on the show today.
We do have an Oscar winner. Someone you cajoled, bribed. Yes. How did you get him on the show, Charles?
Graham Moore is he won the Oscar for writing the screenplay for The Imitation Game. And then a couple years ago, he was the writer-director for the movie The Outfit with Mark Rylance. He's also a novelist, too. Graham has written 2 great novels. One is The Sherlockian, and the other is The Last Days of Night. And those are both great novels you should check out if you haven't already. But I know Graham going back to 2009. We worked on a project. We actually talk about it a little bit in the interview, so we can kind of let that play out, I think. But do you want to do your favorite part of the show?
Yeah, let me do my favorite part of the show, which are my shout-outs. And, of course, As always, this episode is brought to you by the great Jeremy Dillon and his podcast, My Favorite Album. This episode is also brought to you by John B., Elvis Ripley, and Suche. And most of these gentlemen show up for our monthly Patreon. So if you want to know the faces and the minds behind these names, join that Patreon. But Charles will tell you how to join it when we come back. Graham Moore, welcome to the podcast. I know you have an Oscar, but this must be a highlight for you.
Honestly, you guys, I cannot tell you, as a longtime fan of both the Mission Impossible franchise and this podcast, I feel like I'm more excited to join this podcast than I would be to write a Mission Impossible movie. Like, this is my Mission Impossible right here. I love this podcast so much. And I was saying this I emailed Charles about this the other day. I think it's rare that you have a podcast that gets to do such a deep dive into, in this case, 6 movies, right? You get to go through every aspect of the filmmaking process on only 6 movies. So you get to sort of hear from so many different people who've been involved, different stories, get to really analyze them sort of again and again and again. And I think that kind of film education is, I don't know, invaluable. Like, how often do you get to see the same movie over and over again?
There's something maybe a little obsessive about it.
Yeah, something's a little off about us. Yeah.
I don't know, but that's how you learn how things work. I need to honestly tell you guys, I have learned a lot about filmmaking from listening to your podcast about this, because you guys are talking about movies I know well, and you're talking about them in such granular detail and are such great hosts in terms of talking to the actual filmmakers behind these films, as opposed to people like me, who just watches them as a fan. It's pretty remarkable, the sort of stories and detailed filmmaking information that you're able to tease out of people. So my hat's off to you both for it.
When you worked with Charles, did you ever hear him talk about Mission Impossible, or was this a surprise to you? Is this his hidden desire?
A great question. So I don't know if you're going to do an intro where you talk about this, but so Charles and I worked together. We were like writing 14 years ago. Charles and I just moved to LA. I was living on my friend's couch, sort of trying to get a job in Hollywood somewhere. And the first job I got, thank God, was alongside Charles writing zingers uncredited for this reality show. And it was...
I think you got away with not getting a credit. Somehow it didn't end up on your IMDb, but it's on mine, I think.
Really? Don't... If you could do me a favor and not email anyone from IMDb about this. But no, it was, I mean, Charles, I don't know what your memory of it was, but I loved it. I mean, it was really, we had a good time, and everyone there was such a nice person, such a thoughtful person.
Yeah.
We all knew sort of what we were doing, right? It was
a group of really talented people. I mean, obviously you're one of them. You went on to win an Oscar. It's pretty incredible. I don't know how much we can say about it because we're not supposed to say stuff, right? I
think the statute of limitations has run out 14 years later.
It was a reality show, and we were working on a reality show, and I don't know. It was a room of writers, but not necessarily a writer's room.
Yes, it was. I mean, it's funny. I think other people, you hadn't worked on reality shows before that, right? I certainly hadn't. I mean, I'd never worked at all in Hollywood. I know other people, other friends of ours who were on that staff did, and so I was shocked. I remember having this kind of peek behind the curtain moment at realizing that, oh my gosh, reality shows have writers sometimes to write lines for some of the actors to say, or to suggest lines, in our case, for some of the actors to say. Uh-huh. And everyone else was going, oh wait, you didn't know this was all fake? You're such a country bumpkin, like showing up here in LA, not knowing anyone. I felt horribly naive and behind the curve, as I felt in probably each of the 14 years since. So it was a good introduction to this town.
Yeah, so that's how we became friends, and then for years, you know, we've kept in pretty good touch, I guess. But like I you know, you went on to write Imitation Game, which won the Oscar, and then you've now recently wrote and directed The Outfit, which is a great movie, and it was so awesome. I wanted to get you on the show then, but I was a little bit embarrassed to ask you, because I was like, I don't know if he likes Mission Impossible, so I don't know if I want to ask him. But then it was so nice of you to reach out and say you were a fan, and I was like, oh, we got to get him on the show. This is awesome.
I know. I'm so thrilled to do it. No, honestly, I was even hesitant. This is a good lesson. my wife actually encourages me to do this. I'm really bad about reaching out to people whose work I really admire. And then my wife is the one, whenever I mention it, whenever I say to her, like, oh, I've been listening to this podcast. You know, my old buddy Charles has this Mission Impossible podcast. I'm listening to it all the time now. I really love it. It's so cool. And she's the one who always goes, why don't you just send him a message? And I go, oh, I don't know. Is that weird just to send a message? And she's always going, why are you such an idiot? Why are you so bad at routine human interaction? Just send, it's a nice thing. Like, you're not going to ruin someone's day by sending them a message saying, oh my God, I really like this thing you did.
Yeah.
So I guess we did not talk about Mission Impossible 14 years ago on that reality show. We both had this secret love for this wonderful film franchise that went unspoken.
I had like kind of it feels like it would be something that you would love, but I just never asked. I wanted to I emailed you when the outfit came out, and I wish I had just straight up asked you, like, hey, do you like me? It just would be a weird thing to be like, oh, I do a podcast, and I don't know, it just didn't bring it up. But anyway, let's talk about what is Mission Impossible to you, you know, and how did you first get it? Were you a fan of the show at all, or was it just the movies? And
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I remember Mission Impossible, the first movie, being a really formative moment in my kind of early film-going life. I think it came out in 1996, right? So I was 14, 15. I grew up in Chicago. I didn't, growing up in Chicago, I didn't know anyone who worked in movies. I had never met anyone who worked in movies. That was something people did on the coast. Like, I just sort of didn't know. It was its own world. But I remember so vividly when it came out. My parents had split up when I was little, and I would go to visit my dad in this little apartment, and he sometimes on the weekends, and he would often have to go off to work, so me and my little brother would just sort of get left in this apartment with like a VCR to entertain us. And there was a Tower Records, if we remember those, a block away, and they had a little video rental section. And I remember, I think I saw the first Mission Impossible for the first time renting a VHS tape from that Tower Records and going back to my dad's empty apartment to watch it and just being obsessed. And I remember watching it sort of over and over again because it was that first movie is so intricate, right? The plotting is really, really complicated. It's really, really detailed. And I was even thinking as I was sort of getting ready to have this conversation with you today, it's so funny that Christopher McQuarrie, of all people, is sort of now leading this franchise because The Usual Suspects, which he sort of famously wrote, which came out a year earlier, was another one of those formative film experience that I had. I mean, when Usual Suspects came out, I didn't just rent that VHS. I remember buying the collector's edition VHS set. They used to do this thing where, now on a Blu-ray, you can listen to director's commentary by just sort of turning on and off an audio track. But back then, you actually had to have two separate VHS tapes. So there was one VHS tape that came in the set that had the movie with the normal audio, and another one that had Christopher McQuarrie sort of doing commentary for Mission Impossible, or for Usual Suspects.
I didn't know that was a thing. I would have loved to have had that when I was a kid.
It was so cool, and I remember that. Two of my really early formative film experiences were Usual Suspects and the first Mission Impossible movie. I mean, I remember actually from Chris McQuarrie's, VHS tape commentary, you had to, plug the second VHS tape in where there was no audio track from the movie. It was just picture from the film and an audio track of Christopher McQuarrie and Bryan Singer sort of talking through the movie together. And I remember that being the first time I became aware that, okay, wait, so this movie has a writer and it has a director. There's two people and they have different jobs. That's interesting. How does that work? How do these sort of two roles work together, and where do they agree and where do they disagree, and where does one end and the other begin? And I remember that VHS commentary just being this tremendously formative moment in my film-going life. As I remember, Mission Impossible being. I mean, that first Mission Impossible, like Usual Suspects, is just so kind of deliriously complicated.
Is it too complicated? Because there have always been complaints of it, and we don't really find it to be that. But did it feel that way to you?
No, I was shocked. I remember loving it, and then looked up. So I grew up in Chicago, right? So if you were growing up in Chicago in the 90s, among the kind of pole stars of one's life were Michael Jordan and Roger Ebert. Like, that is Chicago in the 1990s.
Oh, yeah.
And so Roger Ebert's reviews, I mean, we'd all read them in the Sun-Times weekly. I loved them. And I remember he wrote a relatively tepid review of Mission Impossible when it came out, sort of arguing that it was too complicated. And I remember that being a moment of going, oh, I disagree with this. I love Roger Ebert, but this is not too complicated. I can follow along. And so it's funny, actually, just an hour ago, I went online and looked up, I wanted to read that review again, just to see what it was like. It's online on rogerebert.com. You can find it. He does sort of argue that it's too complicated, and that he couldn't follow it. Though then I looked up Roger Ebert's initial review of Usual Suspects, which was a pan. He was like, this is way too complicated. I have no idea what's happening here. Who's Kaiser Soze? I don't get it. What is this movie about?
Wow.
It was, I just read it a few minutes ago. It was really interesting to see that criticism being leveled at both of those things, because I think those are both relatively intelligible movies. But I think that's something that the Mission Impossible franchise has sort of continued with, right? Like, they have deliriously complicated plotting all the way through Fallout in ways that other major kind of studio franchises don't, right? I feel like, if anything, in the last decade, studio franchise plotting has gotten simpler, and Mission Impossible has kind of defiantly said, nope, this is going to be complicated, guys, and we're going to expect our audience to follow it. And sure enough, they're right.
Did people say the outfit was too complicated?
The outfit is a really complicated movie. Well, it's funny. I feel like, I mean, there were a couple of reviews that said it was too complicated, and other people seem to follow it. I mean, you can tell that I clearly love movies with really, like, deliriously complicated plots, or that I feel like you can expect. I feel like something I've learned from the writers and filmmakers I admire, and certainly Christopher McQuarrie is in that camp, which is that you can ask an audience to follow along to really complicated storytelling. You have to give them guideposts along the way, but don't dumb it down for them. And if they don't get all of it on a first viewing, that's okay, as long as they get the gist of it. You know, I think, and we always thought that, I mean, outfit it's in some ways it's the antithesis of a Mission Impossible movie, right? Because it is all set in one location. There are 7 speaking parts in one building, right? It's sort of as confined a kind of mystery thriller as could possibly exist. And the challenge of it always was kind of, could we get as much kind of full-throated thrill and excitement out of a thriller in one location with 7 characters as, you know, a real movie, so to speak, would get out of lots and lots of locations. But so that part of the way to do that was kind of deliriously complicated plotting. And certainly whenever you're looking at how to do sort of lots of reversals, you talk about the work that's done in many of the Mission Impossible movies, because it's not just that it's complicated. There's lots of those, wait, is this guy a good guy? Is he a bad guy? No, he's a good guy again. No, wait, now he's definitely a bad guy. Like, those sorts of reversals are so kind of beloved by the franchise. And I think you see that in McQuarrie's work from the beginning. I mean, I think I've said this to Charles before, but I think McQuarrie is probably maybe my favorite living screenwriter. I mean, I just think his work from Suspects through Fallout and up to the next 2 Mission movies that we certainly haven't even seen yet at the time of this recording are so kind of unique and stellar. And you see these through lines from it, right? Like, you see these things that he's interested in, things like really complicated plotting, things like, you know, not being afraid to be funny in the middle of really tense sequences. I feel like people forget this about even something like Usual Suspects or his more kind of grungy work. But Usual Suspects is really funny. There's a bunch of, like, out-and-out jokes in the middle of those tense sequences that make him, in some ways, it makes the Mission movies feel like such a extension of the work that he's done before that.
What is it about the Mission Impossible? You're saying that they're more complicated, more complex than other blockbusters. What is it? Can you dive into that a bit? Like, what makes them more complicated to you when you say that? Because I think there's a lot of blockbusters that are kind of convoluted these days. Maybe complicated, but, you know, and I don't know if it's just, what's the difference there, I guess.
That's a really good question. So in my mind, I feel like, and it's funny because I don't want to talk smack about other big studio blockbusters, and yet you get a lot of plotting that kind of goes. There's there's 3 stones. This large person wants to get these 3 stones. That's the plot. Like it's very sort of, okay, that's the gist. You get what it is. And everything that happens around that can kind of become melodrama. I think with Mission Impossible, on one level, you sort of, they remove all the kind of, I love melodrama, but you remove a lot of the kind of, the characters don't get backstories for the most part other than what's going on at the moment. And they're defined by the choices they're making moving forward, not, elaborate flashback sequences to why they became spies or how they got into this line of work in the first place. But you also have, what's a great example of something sort of deliriously complicated? In Fallout, why does Henry Cavill's character allow Tom Cruise's character to make it through the whole Paris party sequence early on after the jump when he knows that he's going to go expose the thing that he's, like, in theory trying to get him to stop doing? I mean, the motivations everyone has a really complicated plan, right? Like, the villains have deliriously complicated plans for getting what they want. And it does make sense, right? Like, if you sort of really get into it, it holds together. But it's kind of like the villains have really complicated plans, and then the heroes have to do really complicated things to get around them, or to figure them out.
Right.
I just watched Fallout again last week as I was thinking about having this conversation and going like, oh man, who has asked the White Widow to ask Ethan Hunt to break Solomon Lane out of the prison transport thing in Paris?
I guess it's the Apostles?
It's really complicated.
Well, but she's also working for this. She's working for the CIA, though. Or
and then she's secretly
MI6.
working for the CIA the
Yeah.
whole time. So that's the whole other secret motivation there.
Yeah.
But she's also kind of in her own interests. I don't know if she's actually fully working for the CIA or if she's just kind of got an ongoing
Relationship.
Relationship with the CIA.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of conflicting motivations between all the different characters, and keeping track of all of it it's a lot.
But it holds together, right? I mean, my point here is not to say this isn't a flaw, this is a feature.
Yeah.
I think it's really exciting that you can go in and sort of say, oh, like, these complicated plots allow for that many reversals, right? They allow for, if the plot wasn't that complicated, going through the movie, you couldn't get the sequence, the mousetrap sequence in which Alec Baldwin's character dies, leading into the third act when they're in London, right? Like, that whole sequence where there's 4 reversals of who's faking who's wearing a mask.
Yes.
And tricking the other one kind of within the span of 5 minutes. Like, you couldn't do that without this deliriously complicated plotting going into that. Like, the plot isn't homework. It's not...
Right.
It's not this thing you have to get through in order to get to the action sequence. They're sort of intimately tied in together. And I think, especially given the sort of novel way these movies appear to be, so I've learned from your podcast, these movies are sort of filmed in the novel way that they're made, and the idea that they're sort of written as you're going along. And it's sort of like why complicated plots are interesting, right? That you find the things you want. I think about this all the time in my writing, that you kind of like find the scenes that you really want to have happen, and then you kind of retroactively construct a plot that allows those things to happen.
Right.
The difference in the Mission Impossible movies seems to be that they've shot many of those sequences already and then can go construct a plot.
Yeah, it's a very modular approach, we've learned. They can switch things up. Things that are shot for the beginning become second act break. It's an interesting process.
Yeah, in some ways it just continues the writing process throughout the film, right? I mean, everyone's doing that. Usually one's doing that with Control-C and Control-V in a copy of Final Draft. They're getting to do it with actual chunks of film, which is amazing. I mean, what a luxury, right? I mean, I think everyone who's been in an editing room has gone... I've made 2 movies, Imitation Game and Outfit, and in both of those experiences, I always find the editing process to be this thing of going, oh God, why am I the worst writer in the world? Like, if only I had known now, if only I knew then what I can see now, that this thing that looks so good on the page doesn't actually work when you sort of put it up on its feet. Or, oh, this long monologue that I thought was so interesting and evocative, and God, what beautiful language I was using, is so much more perfectly conveyed by a single look delivered by a great actress, immaculately photographed, right? Like, everyone who's been in an editing room has those experiences. And it seems like part of the thrill of the process of making the mission movies is they get to, you're not just reliant on, oh, it read well, but now we've shot it, so we're stuck with it. It's, okay, well, we shot it. Oh, and here's what we learned from that. Now we can go shoot it again, or go, design a sequence to allow us to shoot a version of it that is ideal.
Here's a question for you. Is there a scene or sequence from one of these movies that you wish you had written that is just so perfect, so intricately told that you say, man, I wish I could have done that?
Here, can I tell you one that I just completely stole from?
Sure. That's even better.
Yeah, I don't even know if I should admit this. So in Imitation Game, the first movie I wrote was some years ago, but there's this sequence in it where we just completely steal a moment from the first Mission Impossible movie. And we talked about the fact that's what we were doing when we were doing it. There's this thing, Imitation was a long time ago, I'm sure you don't remember it, but there's this bit in it where there's this complicated espionage plot sort of running over the surface of Imitation Game. And, the movie's a true story. It's sort of based on all these real people, these real events. But with so much of the espionage stuff, there was simply no record of what happened. We just don't know. And there's a scene actually at the end of the movie where they all kind of throw all the papers from effectively all their espionage work into a big bonfire and light it on fire, and it all burns up. And that really happened. All of the records from the kind of espionage work they were doing got burnt up in a bonfire. So we'll never know what really happened. So for some of that stuff, we had to kind of build our own, we wanted to create this kind of experiential movie where you were kind of seeing the character of Alan Turing's entry into a world of espionage and skullduggery the way he would have experienced it, right? I think for him, it would have felt like, oh my God, I'm this math professor. Now I'm being thrown into this spy movie. I'm sort of way over my head here. So we had to kind of we wanted to sort of create that experience for the audience. So then it became, all right, let's let's use the elements that we know were really there and to sort of create the spy movie around the character, the way the real person would have, to create the experience that the real person would have had when he was there. But we had to kind of make up our own spy story in some ways, since there were simply no good records. So there's this moment in the movie where there really was this Soviet spy named John Cairncross in his unit at Bletchley Park, and there's a scene in the movie where he figures out who the spy is. He figures out that John Cairncross is really a double agent, and I had originally in the script had a much more complicated version of how he figured it out. And right before shooting, probably a week before we were shooting, we were in our office, and my friend Morton, our director, kind of came to me and said, isn't this it's taking us way too long to get there. Like, can we find a much simpler version of this? Can he figure it out in a much simpler way? And I said, oh, that's a good idea. I see why, the movie is going to start dragging around here, and let's find a simpler way for him to figure out who the double agent is. And so sure enough, we find there are these codes the double agent has written, and they're in a particular cipher, and we kind of change what the cipher is to make it this thing called a Beale cipher. And Beale ciphers are a kind of code that's encrypted with phrases from books, a book or an article or something like that. It needs to be a common phrase. And so usually you use common books that everyone has so that both people on both sides of the cipher can kind of look to the same source when decrypting it. So we said, oh, this will work great. All we need is what's a book that we can find? What's a book that we can have where we can clearly identify, or where the audience will clearly be able to identify the cover, where as soon as the audience sees the cover of the book, they'll know that this means that this person is a double agent. And we looked, it's so funny, this then took us days of going through, like, I don't know, popular fiction, or is it, a really famous book? Is it The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, or something like that? And then I said, in Mission Impossible, they just use a Bible. Because you can do it visually, right? Everybody knows what the cover of a Bible looks like. And everyone went, yes, that's perfect. Everyone knows what the cover of a Bible looks like. You can just show it on the desk and everyone knows what it is. And now we know he's a spy. And that's from Mission Impossible. And I said, yeah, it's from the first movie. And I went through the whole sequence where they figure out, that John Boyd's character is the spy because of the Bible. And the Gideon Bible, sort of famously from that sequence. And I remember having this meeting about it, and everyone sort of stared at me and said, okay, no one will notice that we are borrowing this from Mission Impossible and throwing it in this movie. But It was great. That is a really smart piece of plotting from the first movie, because you need a visual way for, I mean, in that sequence in the first Mission movie, you need a visual way for Ethan to realize that he's who the mole is, and everybody knows what a Bible looks like.
And that wordplay of Job 314 and Job 314, damn, that's good.
Yeah, so it was this funny, when we were using it, it was this funny example of sort of like, I don't know, art imitating life, imitating art, or something, where we were kind of trying to create, in some ways we were sort of trying to create a sort of a plot that trying to create sort of spy movie moments, because we didn't know what really happened in that room on that day. And so it was like, oh, here's this thing we can borrow from a perfect spy movie, the first Mission Impossible. The image of a Bible sitting on a desk letting you know that there was a double agent there. So yes, I only wish I had written that movie. Instead, I just wholeheartedly stole from it so blatantly that I've been worried for 8 years that someone is going to call me and sue me.
That feels like it's a different. It's like not quite the same. I mean, it's like a almost. I would say it's a reference. I wouldn't say you ripped it off.
It's pretty close. What do you just have these similar moments of both Benedict Cumberbatch and Tom Cruise like looking at a desk with a Bible on it and realizing, oh, wait a second, because it's so well done. But yes, that's so good we had to use it for ourselves moment.
Well, I think that they might be taking your Oscar away now that everybody knows this. Hand it to David Koepp and Steve Azalea.
It would be, you know what? David Koepp and Steve Zalian, I think both have Oscars, but if they don't, they should certainly have mine, because God knows those guys deserve it far more than I do. Yeah, that's always one of I remember the weird parts of like someone hands you a gold trophy and you go, oh my God, there are so many more qualified people who don't have like a gold trophy on their thing. I remember that night, like turning to my mom was my date. I remember turning to her and going like, well, you know, now me and Martin Scorsese are tied. We're one Oscar each, and who's gonna break into the head? And you're like, because it's so ridiculous, right? That man should have a dozen of them. So yeah, I should. He can have mine if he needs to increase his haul.
And we're back.
We're back. Part 1 with Graham. This is by the way, I don't know if we want to let everybody know, this is going to be an epic 3-parter with Graham, because we ended up talking to him about so much fun stuff relating to Mission Impossible and beyond as well. But mostly Mission Impossible, because he has so many great thoughts on it, which I was like, I love him talking about the phrasing, the deliriously complicated plotting, which is unlike other franchises. And he gets into that in this episode. And I love his explanation of that, and I love that he loves it. I didn't know if he was going to be a fan of Mission Impossible. I'm so glad that he is, and it makes sense. I had a feeling that he would be, but I was too embarrassed to ask him about, like, oh, you want to come on my podcast? So anyway, I'm glad that it happened. I'm glad that we had him on the show. And what else? Oh, I looked up. I actually found that double VHS of Usual Suspects. I found it on Amazon.
Okay, Tarantino, how much would it set you back?
It's used. It's like used for like $6 or something. So it's not bad. Not bad at all.
Maybe we should get it.
We should get it.
Yeah.
It looked like it almost was it had like bonus collectibles as a third slot, which I don't know if that was a third VHS tape or if it's just shaped like a third VHS sleeve in order to hold whatever the collectibles are.
There used to be like fun stuff packaged with the VHS tapes. Like we were talking about Fargo on the Patreon. Not too long ago, and there was a VHS copy that I had that had a snow globe with the little wood chipper and red flakes of snow. Amazing. This is the fun stuff you're missing.
You know, Tarantino probably has that, right?
Yeah,
he probably has with his epic VHS collection that he talks about. Yeah. So anyway, we should get the double VHS of Usual Suspects. I wonder if that's the commentary that they use. That same commentary on later DVD and Blu-ray releases and stuff.
Yeah, I'll look into that.
But also hilarious and amazing that Graham admitted to stealing the Bible idea from the first Mission movie for Imitation Game. I'm still gonna say it's a nice homage, not stealing.
Yes,
but
yes.
You know,
A loving homage.
Yes, a loving homage. I think it's different enough. Like, you know, so much of the Bible reveal in the first mission is it's about the Gideons and the reveal of the Drake Hotel, which is a Chicago connection. Graham being from Chicago, but anyway. Whatever. I'm just babbling now. Hey, Drew, have I ever told you about our Patreon?
No, Charles, you haven't told me about the Patreon, but would you mind telling me now?
Okay, great. Yeah, no, I'm surprised we've never talked about it. Yeah, patreon.com/lightthefuse. If you put that in your web browser, you can go to this website that's Patreon, and it's a way to support our show. And you can sign up at multiple levels of support. You can be, we labeled them by the many middle management bosses that are in the Mission Impossible world. But if you are a mission commander, like our favorite Anthony Hopkins, Mission Commander Swanbeck, the mission commander level is the bonus content level. So it's you can get bonus episodes every week. So you'll hear us talk about the Oscars. You'll hear us talk about, recently we've been doing top 10 lists for older movies like 1996 and 2000, years of previous Mission Impossible movies. Anyway, sign up for a Patreon, patreon.com/lightthefuse. If you don't do that, you can also support the show by buying a shirt or a magnet or a pin from our TeePublic store, which is teepublic.com/user/lightthefusepod. It's also linked directly from our website, lightthefusepodcast.com, in the merch tab. And also on our website, you can go to the episode guide and find the show notes for any episode, going all the way back to episode number 1 many, many years ago.
Wow, I think that is just great, Charles, and I really appreciate you telling me about that Patreon. I think everybody should sign up. And, you know, barring that, if you could follow us on social media at LightTheFusePod on Instagram and Twitter, that would be hugely helpful. That's sort of the first line of defense. You know, we put all of our stuff up there immediately.
Yeah.
And also, if you could just like, subscribe, rate, and review wherever you're listening to this podcast. And you know what? Just talk to people about this podcast. We have 2 Mission Impossible movies coming out. I feel like the fever is going to break soon. You know, that people are really going to be getting into it. So tell them about it. Right, Charles?
Shout it out from the mountaintops.
Shout it out.
I also have to give special thank yous. I need to give a special thank you to Thomas Victorio and to Sonia Miranda. Thank you, Thomas and Sonia. And I also want to give a thank you to our editor and mixer, Luke Burson. And I want to thank Kevin Blumenfeld for our legally dissimilar-ish music. It's not quite the Mission Impossible theme at the beginning, but it's close enough for him to get sued, probably.
Yeah.
So, you know, we'll see. Maybe that's in the works. I haven't heard from Kevin in a bit, so...
Yeah.
And also I want to give a thank you to our intern, Amber Cohen. And I think that's it. We got more coming up. Part 2 with Graham.
More next week.
More. Yeah, we do have more of more. Yep.
All right, we'll be back.
Thanks again for listening, everyone. Before we go, another mission, should you choose to accept it, please rate, review, and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And remember that you can follow us on Twitter and Instagram at LightTheFusePod, and email us questions or comments at lightthefusepodcast@gmail.com. This message will self-destruct in 5 seconds.